The hardest battles aren't fought with weapons. They're fought with patience, waiting for the moment when the people who dismissed you finally understand what you were trying to tell them. The morning briefing room at Udeid Air Base smelled of stale coffee and recycled air, the kind of atmosphere that settled into uniforms and skin after weeks in the desert. Captain Sarah Chen stood at the back of the room, her intelligence folder pressed against her chest, watching the squadron commanders file in with the casual confidence of men who'd flown combat missions for decades. She'd been in this room before, many times, and each time she'd felt the same invisible barrier, the slight pause when officers noticed her, the almost imperceptible adjustment in posture, the way conversation shifted when she approached. It wasn't hostility exactly. It was something more subtle, the quiet assumption that whatever she had to say couldn't possibly be as important as what they already knew. Sarah had spent 14 years building her career in Air Force intelligence, specializing in pattern analysis and threat assessment. She'd predicted the timing of 3 major insurgent offensives, identified supply chain vulnerabilities that had saved aircraft and crews, and developed analytical frameworks now used across the intelligence community. Her file was thick with commendations and citations, with glowing evaluations from commanders who'd learned to trust her instincts. But files stayed in folders, and in a room full of fighter pilots, the woman who studied satellite imagery and communications intercepts would always be the one who hadn't been there, who hadn't felt the G-forces, hadn't heard the missile lock warnings, hadn't made the split-second decisions that separated living pilots from memorial services. She understood their skepticism. In some ways, she even respected it. These men had earned their confidence through years of training in combat, through watching friends die and learning to live with the weight of decisions made at 400 knots. They didn't trust easily, and they shouldn't. But understanding didn't make it easier, not when she'd spent the last 72 hours analyzing data that pointed to something they weren't seeing, something that could get people killed. Colonel Marcus Webb took his place at the front of the room, his silver eagles catching the fluorescent light. He was a legend in the fighter community. 300 combat missions, 2 distinguished flying crosses, the kind of record that commanded respect without requiring explanation. When he spoke, people listened. "All right, let's get started," he said, his voice carrying the gravelly authority of command. "Today's mission package is straightforward. Strike on the weapons depot at grid reference Alpha 7. We've been watching this target for 2 weeks, and CENTCOM wants it gone. Weather's clear, threat assessment is low, and we've got good coverage from the AWACS. Any questions?" Sarah felt her pulse quicken. This was the moment she'd been dreading, the moment she'd have to stand up in front of these men and tell them they were wrong. She raised her hand. Webb's eyes found her in the back of the room. His expression didn't change, but she saw the slight tightening around his jaw. "Major Chen, you have something to add?" "Yes, sir." She moved toward the front of the room, her folder open, her voice steady despite the attention now fixed on her. "I've been analyzing the communications traffic around the target area for the past 3 days. There's a pattern I think we need to consider before we launch this strike." She spread her materials on the briefing table, intercepts, satellite imagery, movement analyses she'd compiled through sleepless nights. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the maps and photographs, making the data seem starker, more urgent. The depot has been receiving unusual vehicle traffic over the past week. Not military vehicles, civilian trucks, arriving at irregular intervals, always at night. The communications we've intercepted suggest they're moving something valuable into the facility, not out of it. Webb crossed his arms. "And your conclusion?" "Sir, I believe this is a trap. The enemy knows we've been watching this target. They've been seeding intelligence suggesting high-value weapons storage, but the patterns don't match genuine military logistics. They match a deliberate operation to draw us in." She pointed to the satellite imagery, her finger tracing the routes she'd spent countless hours mapping. "These vehicle movements, they're too regular, too predictable. Genuine supply operations have variation, delays, complications. This looks like a schedule designed to be noticed. And the communications traffic has the same quality. It's too clean, like it's meant for us to intercept." The room had gone quiet. Sarah could feel the weight of their skepticism, the unspoken question hanging in the air. Who is this woman to tell us what's real and what isn't? Lieutenant Colonel James Harrison, the deputy operations officer, leaned back in his chair. "Major, with respect, we've been tracking this depot for 2 weeks. We have confirmation from multiple sources that it's holding chemical munitions. CENTCOM has signed off on the strike. Are you suggesting we ignore all of that based on patterns?" "I'm suggesting we consider the possibility that we're seeing what the enemy wants us to see." Sarah kept her voice level, professional. The patterns I've identified are consistent with a deception operation. And if I'm right, they're not just trying to waste our ordnance. They're planning something for when our aircraft are committed to the strike. She could feel the resistance building in the room, the collective weight of experience and authority pressing against her analysis. These were men who'd trusted, their instincts through dozens of combat missions, men who'd learned that hesitation could kill. Webb studied her for a long moment. His face was unreadable, but she could see him weighing her words against everything else he knew. The intelligence reports, the command pressure, the mission timeline, the career implications of delaying a strike based on the concerns of an analyst who'd never sat in a cockpit. "Major Chen," he said finally, "I appreciate your diligence. But we have confirmed intelligence from assets on the ground, corroborated by signals, intelligence, and imagery analysis from multiple agencies. You're asking me to disregard all of that based on what you describe as patterns that no one else has identified. Sir, the patterns are there. I can show you. The mission proceeds as planned." His voice carried the finality of command. "You're dismissed." Sarah gathered her materials in silence. She'd known this would happen, had prepared for it even. But knowing didn't stop the frustration from burning in her chest, the bitter certainty that she was watching something terrible take shape and couldn't stop it. She paused at the door, turning back one last time. "Colonel, I'd like to request permission to remain in the operations center during the mission. If I'm wrong, I want to know it. And if I'm right..." Webb's expression softened, just slightly. "Permission granted, but Major, I hope for everyone's sake that you're wrong." So did she. The hours between the briefing and the mission launch passed with agonizing slowness. Sarah sat at her station in the intelligence cell, reviewing her analysis again and again, looking for any flaw in her reasoning, any possibility that she'd missed something. She thought about the pilots who would fly this mission. She'd learned their names, their faces, their families from the personnel files she'd reviewed as part of her threat assessment. Captain Michael Torres, Viper lead, married, 2 children, a photo of his family taped to his instrument panel. Lieutenant David Park, Viper 2, engaged, planning a wedding for next summer. Captain James O'Brien, Viper 3, first deployment, eager to prove himself. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Mitchell, Viper 4, the only other woman in the squadron, flying her last mission before rotating home. These weren't abstractions to her. They were people. People whose lives depended on intelligence she'd provided and warnings she'd tried to give. The operations center hummed with the controlled tension of a combat mission in progress. Sarah stood at her station, monitoring the communications feeds, watching the blue icons representing friendly aircraft move toward their target with the precision of a choreographed dance. 4 F-16s, call sign Viper flight. 8 air crew who'd woken up this morning, eaten breakfast in the chow hall, joked with their friends about nothing important. 8 people who trusted the intelligence that had put them on this heading, toward this target, at this moment. Sarah's eyes moved between screens, tracking the data streams, looking for the anomaly she knew was coming. She'd been at this long enough to recognize the quality of her own intuition, the way certain patterns spoke to her in a language that wasn't quite conscious, the accumulated weight of thousands of hours of analysis crystallizing into certainty. She was right. She knew she was right, but being right meant nothing if she couldn't prove it before those aircraft reached the target. The radio crackled with routine traffic, navigation updates, weather reports, the calm professional voices of pilots and controllers moving through the familiar rhythm of an airstrike, everything proceeding according to plan. And then she saw it. A burst of communications traffic from a location 30 miles east of the target, a frequency they hadn't been monitoring, using a protocol she'd never seen before. It lasted less than 2 seconds, but it was enough. Sarah's fingers flew across her keyboard, pulling up the signal analysis, triangulating the source. Her heart was pounding now, the certainty crystallizing into something cold and sharp. She cross-referenced the coordinates against her maps, checking and double-checking, refusing to let the urgency override the discipline that had always been her greatest strength. "Colonel Webb," her voice cut through the background noise of the operations center. "I have something." Webb crossed to her station, his expression skeptical but attentive. She pointed to her screen, the data streaming across it in columns of numbers and coordinates. "This transmission, it originated from a mobile platform, moving parallel to our strike route. The timing corresponds exactly with Viper Flight's approach to the initial point. And the frequency..." She pulled up another window. "It's a fire control radar, surface to air. They're tracking our aircraft." Webb's face went pale. That area was cleared. We have no indication of SAM activity in that grid. They've been hiding it, sir, moving it at night, using civilian vehicles for cover. This is what I was trying to tell you. The depot isn't the target. Our aircraft are. For a moment that stretched into eternity. Webb stood frozen, processing the implications. The color drained from his face as he understood what they were facing. A coordinated ambush, carefully planned, patiently executed, designed to destroy American aircraft and the people inside them. Then he grabbed the radio handset. Viper lead, this is Overlord. Break right immediately, bearing 270. Pop chaff and flares, descend to the deck. We have indication of hostile fire control radar. You're 11 o'clock, 30 miles. The radio exploded with activity, terse acknowledgments, the controlled urgency of pilots responding to a threat they couldn't see. Sarah watched the blue icons on the screen swing. Away from their original heading, 4 aircraft executing an emergency brake in perfect synchronization. And then, the sky lit up. The missile launches appeared on radar as bright blooms of energy, 4 weapons rising from concealed positions, tracking toward the space where Viper flight would have been if they hadn't turned. Sarah counted the seconds, her breath frozen in her chest, watching the geometry of life and death play out in icons and numbers on a screen. The missiles passed through empty air, their guidance systems searching for targets that were no longer there. One by one, they exhausted their fuel and fell back to Earth, their deadly potential reduced to scattered debris in the desert. The radio crackled. Overlord, Viper lead, 4 aircraft safe. Whatever just happened, we owe somebody a drink. Hell, we owe somebody our lives. Webb set down the handset. His hands were shaking slightly, the only sign of the fear that must have gripped him when he'd realized how close they'd come. The operations center was silent, every operator understanding the weight of what had just occurred. He turned to Sarah, and for the first time, she saw something in his eyes that wasn't skepticism or dismissal. It was the dawning recognition of a man who just watched his assumptions nearly kill 4 of his people. Major Chen, he said quietly, walk me through everything, from the beginning. The debrief lasted 6 hours. Sarah laid out every piece of her analysis, the communications patterns, the vehicle movements, the anomalies in the intelligence that had seemed too clean, too convenient. She showed them how the enemy had constructed an elaborate deception operation, feeding false information through channels they knew the Americans were monitoring, building a picture designed to draw aircraft into a carefully prepared kill zone. It was masterful work, really. Whoever had planned this understood American intelligence gathering better than most Americans did. They'd exploited assumptions, manipulated patterns, created a reality that existed only in data streams and satellite imagery, and Sarah had seen through it. Not because she was smarter than anyone else in the room, but because she'd spent 14 years learning to look at information differently, to see the shape of what wasn't there as clearly as what was. When she finished, the room was silent. The squadron commanders who'd filed in that morning, with casual confidence, now sat with the weight of what they'd almost done pressing on their shoulders. 4 empty chairs at the next briefing, 4 families receiving visits from notification officers, 4 names added to memorial walls. It hadn't happened, but it could have, and that knowledge changed something in the air between them. Colonel Webb stood. Major Chen, I owe you an apology, and more than that, I owe you recognition for what you did today. You saved 4 of my people. You did it by trusting your analysis, when the rest of us wouldn't listen. He paused, choosing his words carefully. I've been flying combat missions for 23 years. I've learned to trust my instruments, my training, my wingmen. But I forgot something today. I forgot that the people who sit at these desks, who spend their nights staring at data that would put most people to sleep, they're part of the team too. They see things we can't see. And when they tell us something's wrong, we need to listen. He extended his hand. Thank you, Major, on behalf of Viper Flight, and on behalf of everyone who would have had to live with the consequences if you'd been wrong and I'd been right. Sarah shook his hand. Her throat was tight with emotions she couldn't quite name. Relief, vindication, exhaustion, and something deeper. The recognition she'd been fighting for finally offered freely. I was just doing my job, sir. No. Webb's grip tightened. You were doing more than that. You were fighting for your people even when they didn't know they needed you. That's not just a job. That's leadership. The weeks that followed changed Sarah's relationship with the squadron in ways she hadn't anticipated. The invisible barrier she'd felt in briefing rooms didn't disappear overnight. Decades of institutional culture couldn't be erased by a single incident. But something had shifted. The pilots who'd once looked past her now made a point of stopping by her station, asking about her analysis, listening when she spoke. She found herself invited to planning sessions she'd never been included in before. Her assessments carried weight they hadn't carried before. And slowly, through the patient work of daily interaction, she began to build the trust that she'd earned in a single terrible moment. But Sarah understood something the pilots were still learning. The real work wasn't in the dramatic moments. It was in the thousands of hours that came before and after. The careful analysis, the attention to detail, the willingness to sit with uncertainty until patterns emerged from chaos. She thought about the families of Viper Flight, the wives and husbands, the children, the parents who'd never know how close they'd come to loss. They'd never hear her name, never know she existed. And that was fine. That was the nature of intelligence work. The victories were silent, and the failures were catastrophic. She'd chosen this path knowing that. Chosen to work in the shadows, to be the person who saw threats before they materialized, who spoke unwelcome truths to people who didn't want to hear them. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't the stuff of movies or medals. But it mattered. 3 months later, Sarah received orders transferring her to the Joint Intelligence Center at the Pentagon. Colonel Webb wrote her a letter of recommendation that was, in its way, more meaningful than any official commendation. Major Chen represents the finest qualities of an intelligence officer. He wrote, "She combines technical expertise with moral courage, the willingness to advocate for her analysis even when facing skepticism from senior leaders. On, date redacted, her persistence and professional judgment directly saved the lives of 4 air crew who would otherwise have flown into an enemy ambush. She did this not by demanding attention, but by earning it through the quality of her work." He added a personal note at the bottom, handwritten in the margins. "I was wrong about you. I was wrong about what you could contribute. I won't make that mistake again. And I'll make sure no one in my command does either. You've changed how I think about intelligence and how I think about the people who do this work. Thank you for being patient enough to let us learn." Sarah read the letter in her quarters, alone with the desert night pressing against her window. She thought about all the moments that had led to this. The dismissals, the skepticism, the quiet battles fought in briefing rooms and planning sessions, the constant pressure of proving herself to people who'd already decided what she could and couldn't do. It would have been easier to give up, to accept that some doors would never open, that some rooms would never welcome her. She'd seen others make that choice, watched talented officers let their voices fade because the fight seemed too hard, the barriers too high. But she'd stayed. She'd kept working, kept analyzing, kept speaking up even when no one wanted to listen. Not because she was certain she'd ever be heard, but because the work mattered too much to abandon. And in the end, that persistence had saved lives. Not through heroics or drama, but through the patient, unglamorous discipline of doing her job better than anyone expected her to. That was the lesson she'd carry forward, the lesson she'd teach to every young analyst who came after her, who faced their own walls of skepticism and dismissal. The work itself is the answer. Do it well enough, long enough, and eventually the walls come down. Not because you demanded it, because you earned it. The Pentagon assignment brought new challenges and new opportunities. Sarah found herself briefing generals, contributing to national-level assessments, shaping the intelligence picture that guided decisions affecting millions of people. And she found herself mentoring the next generation, young analysts who reminded her of herself, who came to her office with questions that weren't really about tradecraft or methodology. "How do you make them listen?" a young captain asked her one afternoon. "I know my analysis is good. I know I'm right. But when I try to present it, they don't take it seriously. They see my rank, my age, and they've already decided what I can contribute." Sarah leaned back in her chair, remembering all the times she'd asked the same question, felt the same frustration. The captain's eyes held the same mixture of determination and doubt that Sarah had seen in her own reflection years ago. "You don't make them listen," she said. "You earn the right to be heard. It's slower, it's harder, and it's not fair that you have to work twice as hard to be taken half as seriously. But it's the only way that actually works." She pulled out a folder, the after-action report from the ambush that never happened, the mission that had changed everything. "I spent 3 days trying to get anyone to look at this analysis. 3 days of being dismissed, ignored, told I was seeing patterns that weren't there. And then, for 5 minutes, everything I'd built over 14 years came together. One moment where they had to listen, because lives were on the line." She handed the folder to the young captain. "But here's the thing. That moment only mattered because of everything that came before it. The years of building expertise, the reputation for being thorough, for being right more often than wrong, the relationships I'd built, even with people who didn't take me seriously. When the crisis came, they knew I wasn't someone who raised alarms without reason. The captain studied the report, her face thoughtful. "So, you're saying I need to be patient?" "I'm saying patience is a weapon," Sarah replied. "The most powerful one you have, because the people who dismiss you, they're counting on you to give up. They're counting on you to get frustrated and stop trying. And every day you don't give up. Every day you keep doing excellent work. You're proving them wrong, not with words, with results." She smiled, a little sadly. "It's not the inspiring answer, I know that. You want me to tell you there's a shortcut, a way to make them see you for who you are right now, but there isn't. The only path is through. And when you get to the other side, when you've earned your seat at the table, you'll be able to open that door for someone else." The captain nodded slowly. "Is it worth it? All the years of fighting for something that should just be given?" Sarah thought about the question, thought about everything she'd sacrificed, everything she'd endured, all the moments when it would have been easier to walk away. "Yes," she said finally. "Because someday there's going to be a young analyst who walks into a briefing room and she's going to present her analysis. And the senior officers are going to listen. They're going to listen because people like you and me changed what they thought was possible. That's not just worth it, that's everything." Colonel Webb retired 2 years later, after a career that had spanned 4 decades and every major conflict since Desert Storm. At his retirement ceremony, he gave a speech about the things he'd learned, the usual reflections on service and sacrifice, duty and honor. But near the end, he told a story that wasn't in his prepared remarks. 2 years ago, he said, "I nearly got 4 of my people killed because I didn't listen to someone who was trying to save them. She was an intelligence officer, a woman, someone who didn't look like the kind of person I'd spent my career trusting with life and death decisions." He paused, his voice roughening. "I was wrong, and I'm standing here today because she was right and because she had the courage to keep telling me so, even when I made it clear I didn't want to hear it." Major Sarah Chen saved those lives, not by flying the mission herself, but by doing her job so well that even a stubborn old fighter pilot had to pay attention. He looked out at the audience, at the sea of uniforms representing every branch of service. "The lesson I want to leave you with is this. Listen to the people who see differently than you do, the ones who come from different backgrounds, who approach problems from angles you've never considered, because the threats we face are evolving, and the people who catch them first won't always be the ones we expect. Our job is to create an environment where those people can speak up, can be heard, can make a difference. That's not weakness. That's how we win." Sarah wasn't at the ceremony. She was at the Pentagon, briefing the chairman of the Joint Chiefs on a developing situation that would occupy her attention for the next several months. But Webb had sent her a copy of his remarks with another handwritten note. "You changed how I lead. You changed how I think, and you did it the hard way, by being so damn good at your job that I couldn't ignore you anymore. Wherever you go from here, know that you've already made a difference, not just for the people whose lives you saved, but for everyone who comes after you. The doors you've opened will stay open. That's your legacy." She kept the letter in her desk drawer, along with a few other mementos. A coin Webb had given her, the citation from the Director of National Intelligence, a photograph of Viper flight taken at their reunion. All 4 pilots smiling in front of an aircraft, painted with the mission marks that included one they'd never flown. These weren't trophies, they were reminders that the work mattered, even when no one was watching, that patience and excellence could move mountains that no amount of argument could budge, that the measure of a career wasn't found in promotions or commendations, but in the quiet impact on people and institutions that would outlast any individual. Sarah Chen retired as a brigadier general, the highest-ranking woman in Air Force intelligence history. At her own retirement ceremony, 30 years after that morning in the briefing room at Al Udeid, she told a version of the story, changed enough to protect classified sources and methods, but true in the ways that mattered. "I spent the first half of my career trying to get people to listen to me," she said. "I spent the second half teaching others that listening is the most important thing a leader can do. Not just hearing the words, but understanding that the person speaking them might see something you've missed." She looked out at the audience, at the young faces in the front rows, the analysts and operators, the officers and enlisted, the people who would carry this work forward after she was gone. "You will be dismissed. You will be doubted. You will sit in rooms where no one thinks you belong, and you'll have to decide whether to keep fighting or give up. I'm here to tell you, keep fighting, not loudly, not with anger, but with the quiet, relentless excellence that leaves no room for doubt. Do the work, trust the work, and eventually, the work will speak for itself." She paused, remembering all the people who'd shaped her journey, the mentors who'd believed in her, the skeptics who'd challenged her to be better, the colleagues who'd stood with her when standing was hard. "I've been asked many times what made me successful," she said. "The answer is simple. I refuse to let other people's limitations become my own. I refuse to accept that the barriers I faced were permanent, and I refuse to give up on people who didn't yet understand what I could contribute." She smiled, the first genuine smile she'd worn in a day full of ceremonies and speeches. That's not a secret. That's not a strategy. It's just a choice you make every day about who you're going to be. And if you make that choice long enough, if you hold on to it through every dismissal and doubt, you'll find that you've built something that can't be ignored, something that opens doors not just for you, but for everyone who follows. The audience applauded, but Sarah barely heard them. She was thinking about the young captain who'd asked her how to make them listen, now a lieutenant colonel running her own shop at DIA, about the countless analysts she'd mentored over the years, scattered across the intelligence community, doing the quiet work that kept people safe, about the 4 pilots who'd grown old with their families, their children and grandchildren, never knowing how close they'd come to growing up without fathers. That was the real legacy, not the stars on her shoulders or the letters after her name. The lives that continued because someone had refused to be silent, refused to give up, refused to let doubt become defeat. The ceremony ended, the crowd dispersed. Sarah stood alone for a moment in the empty hall, looking at the flags and the portraits, the symbols of an institution she'd spent her life serving. She'd proven them wrong, all of them. Every officer who'd looked past her, every commander who'd dismissed her concerns, every voice that had told her she didn't belong. But that wasn't what she was proudest of. What she was proudest of was that she'd proven them wrong by being right, by doing the work, by trusting herself when no one else would, and by being patient enough to wait for the world to catch up. The ones who change things never start out trying to make a point. They start out trying to do a job, to do it so well that denial becomes impossible and doubt becomes a memory. She never demanded to be heard. She earned it, one analysis at a time, one briefing at a time, one sleepless night at a time. And when the moment came that proved everything she'd been saying, she didn't say, "I told you so." She just kept working, because that's who she was. That's who they all are. The quiet ones, the patient ones, the ones who show up every day and do the work, even when no one's watching, even when no one believes. History doesn't remember them, but the people whose lives they saved do, and maybe that's enough. Maybe that's everything.